How's it going, everyone? What of course you'll be seeing today is a breakdown and review of the legendary auto rifle in Destiny called Wolfslayer's Claw 2. To get this weapon, you'll need to beat the final boss in the level 35 Prison of Elders, well, you need to name Skolas, and hope that it drops for you. It's random, so don't hold your breath, and of course, as I'll get to, it drops in multiple element types. There is a Wolfslayer's Claw 1, which doesn't drop in element types, just for the record, and Varix usually sells it every once in a while. Now, as a disclaimer, with the patch that came a few months ago that nerfed auto rifles, most people, including myself, barely use them anymore because for just about every other weapon type, there's a better option for scout, pulse, hand cannons, etc. Having said that, there are still viable auto rifles out there, especially those that specialize in the high impact per shot variety archetype, such as Shadow Price or Grim Citizen from the original base game. The reason I say this is because Wolfslayers 2 is part of that same high-impact auto rifle archetype. So despite being on the receiving end of the auto rifle nerf, you can still find utility with this weapon, especially when it comes to an element being buffed, which this weapon has. Statistically with the stats, it starts with the base damage of a max 365. The fire rate's 77%, the impact is 28, which is of the high variety of course, a range of 33, which is somewhat low, a stability rating of 39%, which is also low, but I'll get to that, a reload percentage of 59, and a starting magazine size of 22. So on preliminary look, you can see the high damage model and quick fire rate stand out, as well as a pretty good reload time, but the weaknesses as stated in terms of stability and range. There are perks that address some of these weaknesses, as I'll get to shortly. In terms of PvP damage output, you can see where the nerf really hits this weapon because it only hits for 19 on body shots and 23 on headshots. With regard to the skill tree, all Wolfslayer's Claw 2 are the same because they have their raid acquired weapons. The element given to you is random in addition. My particular drop gave me Void, which is really nice because now I have a full auto non-hand cannon alternative to the bullet hose that is Atheon's Epilogue. You'll have three clear options in terms of the sights. Fast Draw IS, which buffs stability and reload speed. Red Dot OES, which buffs range and greatly buffs stability. And because base stability is low on this weapon, this sight is my choice. And lastly, Red Dot ORES, which enhances range and reload speed more than stability. So because the stability as stated is low on this weapon, I tend to prefer the Red Dot OES. But if you prefer a reload buff and slight increase to range, use the ORES Red Dot instead. When breaking down the skill tree, the first perk is called Crowd Control, which gives an extra 15% bonus damage for about 3 seconds after you get a kill. As the name suggests, it's useful in situations where there's plenty of enemies, such as the waves in Prison of Elders, especially if you have the Void version during the Vex waves or Void is buffed. The next three perks, which you'll have a choice over, and they're all useful depending on the kind of player you are Flared Magwell, which dramatically increases reload speed, Field Scout, which increases ammo capacity from 22 all the way up to 42, and is incredibly useful for both PvE and PvP, and Perfect Balance, which additionally buffs that low stability count by giving it a massive boost. So obviously you see all three have utility. Personally, I use Field Scout for PvE for the most part, because you don't really need to account for a ton of recoil against a lot of enemies in PvE. But if you really want it to turn to a laser beam, you can choose Perfect Balance to really buff that low stability count. So there's the trade-off, of course. Perfect Balance makes it a laser beam, but you only have 22 rounds. Field Scout gives it 42 rounds, but you have to deal with some more recoil. So, of course, if you can manage the recoil, choose Field Scout. If not, choose Perfect Balance. The last perk, which is actually the only letdown to me of this weapon, is called Mutineer. It gives a chance to suppress a captain's abilities, which is actually quite useful in the high-end Prison of Elders runs, because you see a captain just sort of squirm around with that red cloud over his head. My only issue with it, of course, is that it procs randomly and it has a short duration. And because my weapon is Void, I wouldn't be using it against an Arc Captain's shield. So that's a problem. And it's not terribly influential overall anyway, because you could just switch weapons to really take out his shield, and you could use like Fatebringer the full time if you really want. So it doesn't really impact the weapon, and it's very situational because other than facing like fallen waves, that perk is completely useless. I would prefer it something else that really buffs the weapon's utility. But it actually can be a little bit useful if you happen to get the arc version of this weapon. With regard to my overall impressions in PvE, it is quite useful, especially in void buffs. Like, it makes absolute joke of Nightfall void buffs and Prison of Elder waves where Vex are void buffed. The high impact auto rifle model doesn't immediately dismiss it as an option even post patch, and I think this is actually quite viable in some endgame content. Having said that, of course, there are better options out there because of the nerf to auto rifles, so despite being able to hold its own, if you're looking for a min-max utility weapon, you could use any of the Vault of Glass weapons and you'll probably have more success. And of course the overall utility of the weapon will depend on what element role you get. So with Void more than likely being the most useful potential role because of the huge logjam of Solar and Arc primaries, I would use it for pretty much all Vex runs. It's quite useful there. I wouldn't really consider it like as a full-time weapon of choice usage if it was rolled as Arc or it was rolled as Solar, because there's just a logjam of weapons there. In PvP, it will do best in medium range if you choose the perfect balance perk as your choice. It won't do well in shorter range, so don't engage enemies with this weapon or switch to a shotgun. Additionally, it may stand a chance at longer range, especially if you catch the enemy off guard, but because of that low damage DPS because of the auto rifle nerf, I would stick to medium range if you're going to use it, because it will put you at a disadvantage versus someone with, say, Red Death or Thorn. It's possible to have success, but make sure you really monitor where you're shooting with this weapon. Stay in that medium range, don't engage anything further or shorter. And if you find enemies using a ton of Red Deaths or Thorns, you might want to consider switching to a new weapon. Don't tempt a situation where you're going to handicap yourself. So overall, it will depend on the element that the weapon rolls with to tell you when and where to use it and overall utility. But minus Mutineer, it has a strong set of perks at its disposal and a shadow price type damage high auto rifle impact model, which actually doesn't dismiss it immediately in PvE, but it's not so useful in PvP. Monitor your range and choose your engagements and you should be okay. But as a last closing statement, even if you don't like auto rifles, don't immediately break this thing down, because when the auto rifle buff happens in the future, I expect this thing to be a monster. Hang on to it. Just wait for this thing to get strong again. You'll regret it if you scrap it.